Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Geo Trip. I am so pleased and honored to have with me today Dr. Folarin Kolawole. So let me share a little bit about my guest today. And as I said affectionately, kind of hinting that I know him and I've known him for many years as a fellow graduate researcher, and now he's in the professional world. So I'm very glad he can join us today. Dr. Folarin Kolawole obtained his bachelor's in geology from the Federal University of Technology in Akure, Nigeria in 2008, where he researched and published papers on the brittle deformation of a basement massif in southwest Nigeria. Afterwards, Dr. Kolawole worked in the oil and gas industry in Nigeria for 3 years. He then moved to Oklahoma State University, where he obtained a master's in geology in 2017 and published several papers on the East African rift system and earthquake crustal deformation in active rifts and intraplate settings. After his master's, he moved to the University of Oklahoma, where he obtained a PhD in geophysics in 2020 and spent a lot of time investigating the roles of structural inheritance in injection-induced seismicity. Dr. Kolawole continued his research on the evolution of continental drift rifts, and currently he's a structural geologist in the upstream exploration section of BP America, where he is mapping and analyzing multi-scale structural deformation along the Brazilian South Atlantic rifted margins. Dr. Kolawole enjoys spending time with his family, rock climbing, hiking, and camping outdoors when he's not working or doing research. And I'm going to let you know, I always joke with Dr. Fola, or Fola as I call him, about his time management because I don't know how he packs all the amazing things that he studies, works on, and enjoys into one day. Dr. Fola, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
I am so excited for this conversation. You have no idea. I don't even know where to begin. So I think I'm going to begin with letting you tell our audience your geo story, because you are actually from Nigeria. So I'm pretty sure they want to know, how did you make your way here and what made you decide that you wanted to be a structural geologist of all things?
Right. Good question. So back in Nigeria, while growing up, I grew up in a small city in southwest Nigeria that is located in a basement terrain region where the landscape is dominated by this huge granite domes, which are basically granitic intrusions that are placed within a gneissic basement. So you have all this Precambrian gneissic basement and granites intruding them, such that due to erosion and weathering, the granites kind of stand out as huge domes. And that's what you see around the town, driving around the town. So basically every day I come out of my street and I look at the skyline and I see these big granitic domes. And, on my street, you'll see outcrops of gneisses and migmatites. So essentially, I grew up seeing hard rocks all around me with folded things, faults, little stuff here and there that I did not understand, but it looked fascinating and interesting. So when I decided to study geology, because I hoped to work in oil and gas industry and make some money, I figured out that I could study rocks and, make money while doing that. And I chose structural geology because that just always been, part of me growing up, seeing deformation in rocks all around me. So I chose my undergrad research to be focused on, satellite imagery study of those granitic domes and gneissic terrains in the city, around the city where I grew up. And that was basically what launched me into the world of structural geology and crustal deformation.
Oh, wow. So childhood inspiration for the best of both worlds, working
Right.
with rocks and making money. I love it. I mean, I feel like the story is all too familiar. Something in your childhood kind of triggers this love, this passion. You mentioned the basement, rock, and gneissic, and so can you explain to some of our audience members, like, why are we seeing the basement, and what is this basement that you're talking about?
Yes. So the Earth is made up of a core, right, at the center of the planet. And the core is surrounded by a thick zone that is called the mantle. And that mantle is covered by thin veneer of relatively rigid material, which we call the crust. And that is what we see exposed at the surface. But the cool thing is that the crust itself has, say, two layers. Think about it that way. The shallowest one is the one that we see at the surface, the sedimentary basins, the rocks we see at the surface, sedimentary rocks, blah, blah, blah. But as you go down, you get into the deeper layer, the second layer, which is, kind of relatively more molten a little bit. It can flow, unlike the outer layer that is harder. Also due to temperature and pressure as you go down into the crust, that deeper layer is more molten. It can flow and fold, you know. So when you have erosion of the Earth's surface over a long period of time, this deeper layer is exposed at the surface, such that the style of deformation that you see is similar to, the flowy thing. You see all these patterns of folds rather than, well localized, discrete fractures and cracks. You don't see cracks, fractures. You don't see those. You see more things that fold and flow. So that is what I mean by pegmatites and gneisses. They're basically deep rocks that have been folded and metamorphosed under high pressure and temperature conditions and have been brought up to the surface due to uplift and erosion of the shallower layers. Does that make sense?
That definitely makes sense. I'm pretty sure our audience members are appreciating your explanation and not hearing my voice because you put it so eloquently. So that kind of brings me into talking about your research, some of the things that you worked on for your master's and PhD, respectively, because I mean, you have a very impressive catalog of papers, but the central theme for them pretty much focuses on structural geology and rift systems, and more specifically, the East African rift. So I'd love to talk about that a little bit if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
And before we even get into that, would you like to, in plain language, summarize for our audience what a rift system or rift chain, what does it mean to you?
Good. Yeah. So remember I talked about the Earth's crust, right? That outermost layer. Um, I want to explain this without talking about the lithosphere, but so so okay, let's think about it this way. You know, we all know what plate tectonics is, on big picture. It basically refers to a system whereby we have the outermost rigid layer of the earth, stretching to break apart, and that allows the creation of new oceanic basin, the creation of oceans that separates different continents that were formerly together, right? And in other areas where plate tectonics is happening, you have this plate that are splitting away from each other, colliding with other plates, such that you have mountains forming along the margin of collision. And you also have what we call subduction. So one plate, one rigid, continent or, oceanic lithosphere going down, subducting and, sliding down into the deeper part of the earth underneath the other plate that it is colliding with. So this is plate tectonics. That's basically how the outermost part of the earth has been recycling itself over, millions and billions of years. But the part that I focus on that relates to your question is the part where plates are, splitting away from one another. They're being stretched apart, and the crack and split away from one another. But if we want to talk about what this system or chain of rift basins mean, let's start from um, what is a rift basin? A rift basin is basically a depression at the Earth's surface that is bounded by a normal fault, right? A normal fault is a fault, a surface, a large discontinuity surface that is, let's say, steeply inclined into the Earth, such that the block above it, the block of Earth above it, is sliding downwards along that surface. So as the slant slides downwards, it creates a depression where sediment can accumulate, where volcanic flows can accumulate, essentially a basin, right? That's what a basin is. So now bringing that definition of rift basin back into the context of continents stretching and splitting apart. So imagine you have a trying to think of a very good example that is so natural and it's hard. But so when this is how it works, based on decades of research. Scientists have come to understand that when plates start to stretch apart, they create these little rift basins in a form of isolated basins that are separated from one another, but they basically form a chain. So you have this little isolated basins that are bounded by normal faults, and they are active. They are, the normal faults are actively sliding, and sediments are accumulating within those little pockets, but they've not yet connected with one another, such that as the tectonic forces continue to stretch the continents apart, those little basins are like cracks on the Earth's surface. They begin to grow laterally, such that their tips come closer to one another and connect. That way, a rift basin becomes longer and bigger because now the faults of those basins have connected with one another, and the Earth can slide even faster over a larger area. So the basins just become bigger and longer and bigger. And as the Earth continues to stretch and stretch, it gets to a point where it loses its strength. That outermost layer loses its strength and it splits apart, and mantle comes up to create a new crust, which is what you see beneath the oceanic basins, basically the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean. That is new crust formed by mantle materials coming to the surface to replace the continental crust that has splitted apart. Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense. Very
Okay,
eloquently said, Fola. And just in case Dr. Fola got you a little bit confused, think about if you were to pull apart something at the seam, how it begins to rip or split open,
right.
or for
Exactly.
even more fun, go to Google Earth or google.com maps and type in East African Rift, and you can
Right.
literally see these physical evidence of the Earth pulling apart. Like it's
Absolutely.
phenomenal. It's beautiful. And this type of activity, geologic activity or geologic process, like Fola mentioned, happens both in continental environments and oceanic environments. And
Right.
kind of how Fola and I actually met each other or started talking is because we were both fascinated
Right.
that we both work on rifts, but we work at different parts or points during the rifting evolution of the phase. So
Exactly.
while he looks at the earlier part, I look at the sediment filling in. So once you're pulling apart this landmass or this basin and the sediments start to actually fill into the basin or bowl shape, that's what I think about. But Fola thinks about, oh, what do you think about?
Well, I primarily think about how the crust breaks and slides over, along those fault planes to allow the accumulation of the sediments so you basically take over where I stop, which is, where the bowl forms. I care about the bowl forming. You care about what fills that bowl and how does it fill it, right?
Exactly. And I wanted you to say what you cared about because you do it so eloquently. I have to say, I enjoy reading your papers, even though they take me down the rabbit hole and they make me break out structural textbooks that I thought I would never have to
I'm
use.
sorry.
God, you keep sending me papers. I love to talk about some of the work that you've published because you've found some really insightful things over the years. I mean, you and your contributors and collaborators, I mean, I'm always fascinated to read your work. I would love to talk a little bit about, put you on the spot and ask you, so what's your favorite paper?
So,
Okay.
that's a tough question for me because I feel like every piece of paper itself, published by anyone, is a piece of art. It's a piece of work that
Fair.
contributes something small, even if it's small, contributes something to the body of knowledge on a particular topic. And for me, I try to dissociate myself from my papers, such that I feel like, okay, I learned something or a couple of things through this particular study. And okay, what's the next one? How can I build on this? And it can be hard to be so attached to one. But I can talk about my recent papers and the exciting things that I found and try to communicate through them.
Okay,
Um,
so that's actually a really fair assessment and way to approach it. So I will actually come back to that. I'll ask you to put a
okay,
pin in it because
okay,
I would love to talk about your recent paper because I am still not completely finished reading it. So I would love to hear you summarize it. But I
okay.
would love to, if we could take a second and talk about, because we introduced the audience to basement and what basement
Mm,
means in a rift
right.
system and seeing it on the surface. I'd love to touch a little bit on like some of the controls of basement fabric on the linkage of rift segments. So like if you could take a moment and just briefly share with our audience basic definition of what basement fabric is, and then we could talk about the what controls during the linkages of the rift segments. And we don't have to go into
Perfect.
detail with all the rift segments because that's a
Right.
whole other
So
podcast.
I will start with the analogy that you made about rifting, which is such a beautiful one. You talked about seams, like you're pulling the material apart and it's splitting along its seams. Um, so we can think about continental rifting in the context of you're stretching a piece of cloth like a shirt, apart, and the shirt begins to tear along the threading. Everything is not going to tear once, right? You create this little tears here and there that propagate towards one another and merge, to make the cloth tear apart completely. So that is basically a very good and simple analogy for how pre-existing weaknesses in a material localize damage when you start to put stress on it. So imagine you have this outermost layer of the earth, the rigid crust of the earth, and as you begin to stretch it apart, the deformation localizes the areas where where you're going to first have deformation, where the fault will start forming, will be the pre-existing weaknesses in the crust. So what are those weaknesses? Now we're talking about weaknesses in the basement, what we call it. Well, okay, first, what do we mean by basement? We basically mean the hard rocks that form the deeper layers of the earth and underlie the sedimentary basins. Sedimentary basins are those bowls where sedimentary rocks, so rocks from the weathering and erosion of the hard rocks, you know, sediments or materials that are produced from the erosion and weathering of hard rocks accumulate within depressions in the earth. In rift basins, those depressions are controlled by sliding along faults, right? But the key point is that those depressions are still forming within a basement of hard rocks, right? So that basement of hard rocks basically refer to igneous and metamorphic rocks. Igneous rocks are the ones rocks that are formed from the intrusion of magma into the earth, such that after a lot of years of erosion, the overboarding or whatever is covering them gets eroded off, and then they are exposed at the surface. And these intrusions can cover thousands, tens of thousands of square kilometer areas, like big batholiths, for example. However, as I mentioned earlier, in this conversation, those intrusions, those magmatic intrusions intruded something, like they were in place within a pre-existing basement, pre-existing rock. Those rocks are, the sedimentary basins and what is underneath the sedimentary basins, because the magma came from deep in the earth up through the hard crust up into the sedimentary basins, right? So when the sedimentary basins at the top have been eroded off, what you have left is the folded, the more ductily deformed deeper crust with all these intrusions within them. So essentially, over a long period of time, if you now start having rifting localizing within an area of exhumed or exposed basement, the weaknesses within that basement, such as the folds, shear zones, intrusions, basically you have an intrusion within a folded, rock terrain. The boundary between that intrusion and the rock terrain that hosts that intrusion is a zone of weakness, because the strength of the material will change across from, as you're going from that intrusive body into whatever it intruded. There's a zone of discontinuity or relatively weaker region within the crust. So essentially, as you start to put stresses on the crust, as tectonic forces start to put stresses on the crust, the strain, I don't want to use those terms now, I'm trying to avoid technical terms. Deformation will localize in the weakest zones, which are, those boundaries between intrusions and the folded gneissic terrains around it. And even within the gneissic terrains, the folds themselves define weaknesses within the basement. Shear zones between different terrains within the gneissic domains themselves are also zones of weaknesses where deformation can localize. And we see examples of these things in different parts of the world, different rift settings in the world. You see the rift faults either following those weaknesses or where they step across those weaknesses, or those weaknesses serve as barriers that make the fault bend or stop and then start again somewhere else on the other side of those weaknesses. Basically, these weaknesses, they do a lot of things to those faults and the evolving rift basin over the earlier stages of the life of the rift basin. And this is because these weaknesses extend deep down into the crust, some into the upper mantle. And that way they can continue to localize deformation for a long period of time before the mantle processes now take over, and begin to control how the rifts are forming. So this is why I really enjoy studying early stage rifting, because I can really see how inherited weaknesses impact how basins form and how the faults that define those basins form over time. So bringing all that back into your original question of how pre-existing weaknesses of basement fabrics control rift linkage. Sorry, I had to explain that first.
No, don't apologize. I love the fact that you took the time to use plain language and give that background to my audience and myself, because I will admit, you and I have always battles, because I'm like, why are you working on early rifting? Why not the fill? I love the fill. I mean, and I definitely understand the fascination now that you kind of broke it all down into thinking about how does weakness influence what we're seeing and how these linkages can be made in these weak zones. So I am like glued to the edge of my seat right now.
Good to know. and in fact, the big controversy is in the rifting community, you will see two groups, but in the structural geology part, right? You will see two groups. There are people that really think what you need to weaken the crust or the lithosphere for rifts to form, all you need is magma. You just need heat from deep in the earth to come up, right?
I was going to ask you about.
You need magma, and people like me question people like that. When I look at the western branch of the East African Rift System or Lake Baikal Rift System or the European Cenozoic Rift system, where you see magmatism, but then the magmatism is localized in very isolated points along the chain of rift basins. You don't see the magmatic centers everywhere. You don't see volcanoes everywhere. You don't see lava, everywhere. No, you see this, volcanic zones localized at very few places, right? And you start to wonder how did the crust here or the lithosphere here weaken to localize this big fault and this big deep rift basins with very little magma? How did it form? And that is where pre-existing weakness comes in, right? And that's why I like to do a lot of work on the western branch of the East African rift system, because I can really study how pre-existing weakness controls, rift formation in those places.
See, I have to interrupt you here and admit to the audience that I'm a little bit upset because Fola just stole one of my hot potato questions. I was going to
I'm
ask
sorry.
him. I was going to ask him what end of the rift controversy does he stand on?
Well, I can answer that question. I've not answered that question actually, and maybe my answer may shock you. Should I answer it or wait?
It is a huge controversy in the rifting community, and I think I will pull that from the hot potato segment. Since you're doing such a beautiful job of eloquently explaining to the audience using plain language, can you tell us, Dr. Fuller, what end of the controversy do you stand on? And if you don't mind sharing with them what the controversy is. You briefly touched on it, talking about there are people who believe that this magmatic presence is necessary, it's fundamental. But can you elaborate and then let us know where you stand?
Good question. So just to repeat what the controversy is. So there are two end members of controls on rift localization. One is magma assisted rifting, like you need the heat and the fluids from magma to weaken the lithosphere and the crust for those rift basins to form, right? Before you can break the lithosphere and the crust, which is the outer veneer of it, you need heat and you need the fluids. And there's the other the other group or the other end member that thinks that even if you don't have magma and its associated fluids present, you can still weaken the lithosphere and the crust and break them apart, at least at the earlier stages, to localize rifts. And I stand at the middle. When I studied my master's degree, I was looking into rift and I was looking at magma poor rifts, so areas where you don't see a lot of magmatism, but you see rifting. And I was strongly convinced that you really don't need magma to weaken the lithosphere. But over time, I started looking more into areas of rift nucleation. So even areas where you have rifts forming beneath sediments and they are yet to be exposed at the surface, right? And I realized, like, my studies were actually showing, and those of other people in those areas actually showing, that even within those areas, even though you see the fault, having associations or relationships with the pre-existing weaknesses, there is melt at depth. There are fluids that are causing the weakening of the lithosphere and the crust and allowing the fault to actually even slide more. It's almost like, there's a forbidden term in structural geology when you're talking of fault reactivation, which is lubrication. Like when you're talking of fluids lubricating fault, it's almost like forbidden because it doesn't really explain the mechanics of fault reactivation. It makes it seem like you're putting oil on the surface, which is not exactly how fluids work in terms of how they reactivate faults. But to explain it to a layman, we can think of it as fluids creating so much pressure such that it creates a lubricating effect on faults. So you have faults that are trying to follow weaknesses, but then you have fluids and melt from magma and heat, actually making the fault become weaker, right? So that it can even slide more. So at the end of the day, it seems to me that both of them actually work together. You need pre-existing weaknesses and you need melts. You need magma at depth. The magma may take a long time to arrive at the surface, which we're seeing in from how our modeling works in the Malawi Rift. We're seeing areas where it looks like there's magma at depth that is yet to arrive at the surface. So where you see fault at the surface following weaknesses, you could check and see that at deep depth in the crust, there might actually be melt. And this deformation is coupled, both of them are coupled across the lithosphere to allow these rifts to keep forming. So I don't think it makes sense to stay on one end, on either end of the spectrum or the end members. I think we need both.
I really appreciate that answer. And I'm glad that we actually brought that topic up from hot potato, because again, you so eloquently explained the different school of thoughts and where people like you and me who've actually spent some time looking at the western portion of the East African Rift. I will bring us in because you've kind of talked about the driving mechanisms for rifting. You've explained to our audience essentially what rifting is, basement rock, what you care about. And so I kind of want to bring us to your most recent paper, which kind of looks at the interaction zones and the stages of rift linkage. Is that the one you were thinking about?
That's one of those I'm thinking about, but yeah, I can talk about that. I'm sure. So that is a really good one that overlaps with what you do. So I would love to chat about it. Right.
It's a great way to tie in what we started about, what I'm doing, what you're doing, bringing it all home for our audience members. Not to mention, it's a good paper.
Thank you. Good to know. Good to know.
Yes, you'll be cited in my bibliography.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Oh gosh. Okay.
So, if you could like plain language summarize that work that you did, because like I said, it bridges the gap and it also kind of helps to bring the story home for rifting before we shift gears from your academic side to your professional side.
Okay, good. So I explained earlier how this rift systems form as how they initially develop as isolated rift basins, small rift basins that begin to propagate laterally towards one another and then link up to form a continuous rift basin with continuous rift floor, right? Without separation, So I got interested in that research because of an earlier study that I mentored a student on during my master's degree, really exciting study in which we were looking at, two rift basins, the Northern Malawi Rift and the Rukwa Rift. Both are active, and it looks like on one side, both the faults of the biggest faults in the two basins are connected with one another. But on the other side, it looks like they're not really connected. So we were interested in looking at, has these two rifts merged with one another? Have they linked up and merged or not? What is going on? And how are they merging, if indeed they are merging with one another? So, I looked at the basement rocks, myself and the student, we studied the basement fabrics, and we realized that even on this other side where we think they are not really connected, there's actually beautiful fault system that is taking advantage of the weaknesses in the basement to link the two rifts together. So after that study, I started asking myself questions about how do we even know? How can we assess the linkage of two basins? If we're looking at two rift basins that are close to one another and we think that they are about to link or they've not linked or they're interacting, how do we even assess these processes? So there have been a lot of studies on this kind of process, but only from numerical modeling and analog modeling standpoint. So by analog models, I basically mean an experiment in which you create a thick layer of clay in a box, say a wooden box, and you pull that box apart such, okay, I will explain better. So imagine you have a wooden box with an elastic band at the middle such that you can pull the box from side on both sides away from each other, and the elastic band connecting the two wooden parts together, can stretch laterally. So essentially, you pile a bunch of clay on top of that wooden, inside that wooden box, so that you stretch it apart. The rubber beneath stretches, but the clay above deforms, right? The clay above forms cracks that look like real rift basins. So that is what we call analog models. Like as you stretch that box, you see the cracks, basically small rift basins forming in the clay, and you can see how they grow towards one another. And you can do all kinds of things to that clay. You can create weaknesses in different parts and stretch the clay and see how these little cracks take advantage of the weaknesses. Basically, you can study rift process, in such experiment. And there's this other type of experiment that we call numerical models, in which you can create a digital crust, create all the boundary conditions, all the materials, the strength, properties of the crust, and in a 3D block or 2D, cross-section block, and you stretch it apart, you apply forces to stretch it apart and see how it breaks and forms, things like that. You can use that to study rifts. And there's been a lot of studies on rifts based in propagation and interaction and linkage from those models. But when I started looking at those models closely, I realized that there were lots of problems with those models. One is the shapes of the basins that they were experimenting with. All these basins were always parallel to one another, like same orientation, and then they grow towards one another and connect together. I'm like, okay, but then you look at natural rift settings like East Africa, Rio Grande Rift. Well, not in Rio Grande Rift, but well, in some parts of the Rio Grande Rift, the southern
Some
part.
parts of the Rio Grande, though, because San Luis Basin and Hispaniola Basin, that's kind of one of the issues on what I'm thinking about, the linkage versus but the sedimentation, because the rift itself is in parallel. But continue.
Well, it's still even sub-parallel there. It's still sub-parallel. But I'm talking of the
Yes,
south
right.
of the Albuquerque Basin, where you have multiple segments that are like side by side with one another. There's an
Very
area there
correct, yes.
right. So I'm like, okay, these ones have the same orientation, but they are side by side. They are not like just overlapping or in the same line. And you go to other rift settings, like even in the Baikal rift system, in different parts of the East African rift system, in the Cenozoic European rift system, basically, I mean the Rhine graben system, you see that some of these rift basins are like, they are at like 90 degrees to one another, and their tips are close to one another. Some are like oriented 60 degrees away from each other. So I'm like, okay, these rift basins are not parallel. They're like orthogonal to one another, but they are still interacting. And there are places even in East Africa where you see 3 rift basins coming together like a triple junction. And they are young rift basins. So I'm like, okay, what geometry do you call this? These are not parallel at all. And there are places where you see 4 rift basins coming together, right? Even in East Africa. And I'm like, okay, all these rifts are interacting with one another because like at minimum of 3 of them are active. So, okay, if all these rifts are interacting with one another, how do we even assess if they have linked or they are yet to link, or at what stage of linkage they are in? I basically cannot use lessons from those numerical and analog models to assess those kind of the processes in those kind of settings. It doesn't work. So I'm like, okay, I need to pay attention to how these things are happening in natural rift settings. And I encountered a roadblock, and that was in the fact that analog models just show you, oh, see these 2 rift basins before they start to interact with one another, and look, they've linked up with one another. But the processes in between those stages, they are not shown. That is one. 2, those models only assess linkage based on the connectivity of the faults. And I realized that there are places, in East Africa, along the East African system, where the faults have connected, but there's still this exposed basement separating these rift basins. And I'm like, can I assume that these rift basins are connected? Because I cannot see a continuous rift floor between them. There's still a big basement high, an exposed basement region separating them. And I'm like, okay, it looks like we need to reassess how we define the stages of linkage of a rift basin, and that of two interacting rift basins. And that was what got me into the sedimentation part, because I realized, okay, if this, so there are examples of rift basins that looks like they've connected with one another and they have coalesced into a single rift basin. What you see is that they have a continuous rift lake within them, right? An example could be Malawi Rift or Tanganyika Rift. You know, these rifts are very long, they are anomalously long, and they have a continuous rift lake within them. In some other places where you don't have a lot of humidity, you know, not too much rain, or you have rain, but the rift flow has not subsided enough, you would see a continuous river, like a continuous axial stream flowing across from one rift basin to another, which means those two rifts are, you know, their rift floor is still, it's continuous, right? You don't have that exposed basement separating them. And I realized, okay, if that is the end, if that is what you want to get to when two rifts link together, you want a continuous basin floor between them. It means the fault can connect, but it could still take time before that exposed basement goes down, you know, gets eroded and subside. On the hanging wall, or, you know, subsides within that zone that separates the two rifts as they continue to coalesce with one another. And I started paying attention to rift basins in East Africa that are yet to show continuous rift floor. And I realized that, oh, from the basement height, you know, the elevated region between the two interacting rifts, it looks to me that rivers were flowing away from that high into the two rift basins. And then there are places where you see, and in those places you can see faults have actually connected, but you don't see a continuous river flowing from one straight into the other. And I'm like, okay, it looks like we're seeing different stages here, right? Without going into much details, we can basically, so what I did in that study was that I took a lot of profiles across these interacting rift basins, you know, from one rift basin floor or axis across the area separating them into the other rift basin floor. And I was looking at the elevation profile. Do they show a straight flat profile, or is there, does it go up and then down again? And I realized that the profiles were giving me 5 different types of shapes. And I looked more closely into each of those zones of interaction between the two rifts that define those shapes. And I realized that each of those topographic relief shapes are actually telling us something about the stage of linkage and merging of the two rifts. You basically go from a shape in which, you know, in one rift basin, the topography is flat, right, at the middle of the rift. Let's say you have a rift lake there, you know, sediments are accumulating, it's relatively flat. You don't have mountains at the middle of the rift because it's a bowl, sediments are accumulating. And as you draw that profile across the zone separating the two interacting rifts, it basically goes up because you have an exposed basement that is yet to subside and erode, you know, and become down faulted. And then as the profile goes into the other rift, it goes down again into a flat profile. And I'm like, okay, that is one end member. And the other end member is the one that basically shows you a straight horizontal profile as you go from one rift basin to the other across the zone in which it looks like they are interacting with. You know, you don't have a big basement high separating that other end member. So essentially the initial end member where you have a basement high and elevated region separating the two rifts, that is an unlinked, you know, think of it as an unlinked rift system, or what I call unbridged zone of rift interaction. And the other end member is one that we can call a bridged or linked system, in which, you know, the zone of interaction between them has been bridged by faults and it has subsided and it has sediments accumulating above it, you know, to connect the two rifts together. And then you have a continuous rift floor or depositional environment, as someone like you would want to think about it, you know, between the two rifts. That's a long way to explain that paper. And you will see the paper is long, right? You see the paper is long itself, but that's pretty much a summary of the key finding in that paper. It's the fact that rifts interaction and linkage occurs in stages, and those stages can be tracked or assessed if you can look at, okay, are the faults linked up with one another, and what does the surface topography look like as you go from one rift segment to another rift segment, or rift basin to another rift basin across the zone of interaction between them.
Excellent, Paul. I mean, it's definitely a long paper, but it's such an insightful paper because you and your colleagues' findings, it brings such great insight into geometries, structural and morphological implications. And
Right.
even though I don't look at this early stage rifting in such detail, it's something I think about. And kind of like I previously mentioned, something I'm thinking about as I work the Hispaniola Basin, because to the
Right.
south of that basin, sorry, to the north of the basin is San Luis, and
San Luis.
I kind of try to think about the linkage of the San Luis to the north and the Albuquerque to the south, because there's a lot of uncertainty. So I appreciate the paper. Before we actually move on from the paper, though, if you'd love to share with our audience, because you
Hmm.
mentioned about pulling profiles and measuring profiles and drawing, can you tell them where you did this at? Because you didn't go out into the field.
No,
So
okay. Thanks for highlighting that. Yes. So, um, so we have what we call satellite topographic data sets. So basically, we have satellites, flying high in space around the Earth. Some of them are continuous, some of them fly in shuttles, around the Earth. And well, okay, terminologies here. We have shuttles and we have satellites. Satellites are space how can I call it now? Space carriers. They can carry instruments or human beings to space, but they stay relatively permanently in space, right? Unless you want them to come back. But shuttles just go round in, like a trip, a mission, flies around the Earth and then comes back straight, and it's done, right? They don't stay in space permanently like in orbit and keep circling the Earth. No, they don't do that. So we have what we call shuttle topographic data sets. They're actually acquired with shuttles, and the technology that they use to acquire these data sets is what we call radar, right? So these are invisible electromagnetic waves that basically penetrates, the clouds right from space. They are shot down by these shuttles towards the surface of the Earth, and the waves bounce back. And they can penetrate clouds, rain, whatever, and hit the surface of the Earth. And this technology is so awesome because you can keep, shooting the waves down towards the Earth as the shuttle flies around the planet, on its mission to go round, continuously to cover your planet and then come back to the Earth, to the surface of the Earth. But as it continuously shoots down these waves and records the response from basically the waves that bounce back from the surface of the Earth, it can detect both the elevation and the roughness of the surface of the Earth. So essentially, this technology helps to build high resolution topographic maps of the surface of the Earth. So we don't need to go to a location and actually collect elevation data at the surface to know, oh, how high is this point? If I move 20 meters away, how high is this point? If I move, continuously moving along a line, how does the elevation of the surface of the Earth changes? We can actually download these maps and just draw lines on any part of the Earth you want, and it's going to and you can extract data points from those maps, and it's going to give you near accurate estimates of surface elevation of the Earth. And it's so convenient because you don't have to go to a location, you don't have to spend money and travel. You can sit down on your computer and extract these profiles and look at the shapes of the Earth in a particular location that you're looking at. And the resolution for the one that I used for that study is 30 meters spatial resolution. So imagine that at every 30 meters along a profile, for example, I have a point, I have a measurement, which is pretty high resolution because these rift basins we're talking about are about 100 kilometers long. The shortest rift basin that I looked at is about 60 kilometers long. And we're talking of 30 meters sampling interval along a profile, right? Which is pretty good. It's pretty good for what I want to see, the scale of the structures or processes that I'm trying to study. It's pretty good.
Wow. I mean, Fuller, I've always been fascinated and enjoy your work. And so I am enjoying this conversation, but in
Thank
the
you.
interest of time, I, I will I will stop asking questions about roasting. I just kind of wanted to touch on because I mean you're such an impressive researcher, but you're also so well balanced. And I wanted to, introduce to our audience also, aside from Dr. Fuller, the researcher, Dr. Fuller, the professional, because you have just made your 1 year anniversary. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I want to ask, because you talked about like from childhood, seeing the basement rock, being fascinated, wanting to work in oil and gas. And so I just kind of wanted to touch for our listeners, how did you go from such a heavy or rigorous academic career? Because I honestly thought you were going to tell me you got a faculty position. How did you decide to go into oil and gas? And and just kind of briefly touch on that.
Right. So one thing that fascinated me during my PhD um, about the way science is done in some of these oil and gas companies is the fact that they actually have scientists who invest time into studying fundamental processes. So when I got the opportunity to intern with BP, um, during my interview, I realized they were so interested in my papers. They asked me a lot of questions about, the fundamental questions about those studies. Oh, what was your hypothesis? Oh, why do you think so? Why not this? And these guys were actually knowledgeable people about tectonics and structural geology. And I'm like, oh, okay. These guys don't care. They don't care only about the oil and gas part, but they actually care about the processes that work in the earth to create the accumulations of those resources that they are exploring. And I realized that one of their strengths is the ability to understand those processes that helps them with their exploration efforts. So that attracted me. And so when I got an offer, well, when I interned with BP, I was given a project that was more like research, you know, and it really fascinated me because, yeah, at the end of the day, the goal is to apply the learnings from that work into exploration, global exploration. Like, what can we learn from this research? How does it help us, to better constrain where we drill for resources? And I was fascinated by the fact that I could I could use my PhD skills, like stuff that I've learned during my PhD to actually, work without losing that passion for discovery and research. And that was what made me accept the offer from BPE back then. And I got some opportunities to go for a postdoc, but I would have to move, locations, and my family preferred, to stay in Texas and, Dallas, Houston area. And so it just worked perfectly well that BP was in Houston, and that worked better for my family. So it was kind of an easy decision to make from that standpoint. But I guess if I didn't get that industry opportunity, oh, absolutely, I would have gone straight into academia. And I must mention that towards the end of my master's degree, I became less interested in working for oil and gas because my advisor then, Estella Tekwana, really inspired me to love research, and just exploring science questions. And and she actually also exposed me to the fact that I can make money doing that without working in an oil and gas company. And I'm like, oh wow, that makes sense. So the opportunity coming later during my PhD just there, and it works better for my family. So I took it up.
I love that answer. And I love the fact that you mentioned Dr. Stella Tikwana, your former advisor, and probably still your advisor, because I know like I know Dr. Tikwana always looks out for her students and knows
Yeah,
what's going on with them.
that
But
is
I
true.
love the fact that you mentioned her, and the knowledge that she bestowed upon you, because it's really important, when going into a graduate program, whether master's or PhD, to have an advisor that is willing to share the breadth and scope of their knowledge, one, and two, to inspire you. So hats off to her and all other amazing advisors out there helping
Right.
to inform our decisions. And of
Absolutely.
course, cheers to BB. They're lucky to have such an amazing researcher as you. That kind of brings me to my wrapping it up, or my final question. Where do you hope to see Dr. Folarin Kolawole, the geoscientist, in the next 5 to 10 years, sir?
That is a tough question. Yeah, well, you know, the reality is that, the oil and gas industry is facing a rough time, and it's likely not gonna last, forever. The industry is not gonna last forever. There's energy transition already going on, and industry, these oil and gas companies are already looking into renewable energy, geothermal systems, other forms of renewable energy. They're investing in carbon storage, other sources of income that still makes use of their existing skills and data and knowledge. So I may have to transition, with any company I continue working with, or if that doesn't work out, I may find myself back in research. I don't know yet. But I'm open-minded. If you work in the oil and gas industry, you have to be open-minded. You have to keep thinking about the future, because the industry is not a stable one. It's just by design. It is what it is, and it's important to keep an open mind.
And that was exactly the route I was hoping that you were going to go to without leading you, for our audience members or listeners who are still in their graduate school career or early career geologists. The importance of being versatile, especially for those of us who are passionate about the oil and gas industry or enjoy working, the fact that we always have to think about diversifying our skill sets and seeking opportunities that combine our knowledge and our passion, but also so that we can, bottom line, support ourselves and our respective families. I mean, Fola, the technical was amazing. So I can't even, I don't even know where to begin. I don't want to wrap up, but I know we have to wrap up. So I'm going to lead you. I'm going to lead you into our hot potato section. And hot potato is a section that Dr. Prince and I, Karen and I, we love to do with our guests, where we shoot out 5 questions at you, rapid fire. First answer that comes to mind. And I've been told that this is harder than the actual technical part of our discussion. So are you ready?
I am not ready, but go ahead. I'm scared.
Right off the, okay, you know what? I'll start easy. What's in your Netflix queue right now?
Well, I'm trying to replenish my queue. I just exhausted it. So
what was the last thing you binged?
Yes. My Name. I don't know if you've seen that show. I believe it's Chinese show, but translated to English, it's amazing. You should see it. It's
okay, I'll put it on my list.
I just finished that like 2 days ago. I loved it. And I finished it in I think I started this last weekend, and I finished it 2 days ago.
We just finished Squid Games, so I will put your recommendation on my list for next month, because I have a paper I'm trying to work on. So second hot potato question. Who has the better jollof, Ghana or Nigeria?
Say that again.
Who has the better jollof, Ghana or Nigeria?
Okay, I wasn't sure if you mentioned Ghana or Ivory Coast. You know the answer to that question. It is freaking Nigeria. Excuse me. I beg your pardon. How dare you? How dare you ask me that question?
I kind of like Ghana jollof better. So
trust me, there's nothing like Nigerian jollof, particularly if you eat it. Look, if you eat Nigerian jollof in the US, you're not eating the real stuff.
Sure, Nigerian jollof in Lagos. Thank you very much.
Yes. Particularly if you eat it at a party. particularly if you eat it at a party, you don't have to pay for it. Ah, tastes so good.
Not good. Good thing not free. It's a saying that we have in Trinidad. But I love it.
Nice,
I'm
nice.
glad. I'm glad that you picked one and you didn't stand in the middle like the Rift controversy. Um,
No, I'm not gonna stand in the middle for that one. No way. I'm too patriotic to do that.
I love it. So, third question: where's your dream location to camp?
To do what?
To camp. I know you're an avid
Ah,
camper,
well,
so.
I don't have I have not I have a lot on my list, and one that I'm looking out to do is the Pacific Northwest trail. I want to do it. It's a long trail. I've heard a lot about it. I did a little bit of it this fall, in Portland, Oregon, in Mount Hood,
Mhm.
because it runs across it. But I I wish I can do the whole thing. I really
Uh,
wish. I've heard a lot about it. There's a lot of, you just keep hiking for days and camp um, along the trail. I don't have a single location yet in mind, like a park or a mountain that I want to go hike and camp on. But the experience of hiking that entire trail is one that I dream of.
that is very fair, and that's very beautiful. I just saw your pictures from Portland. So I
Yeah.
hope whenever you do that full trail that you carry our princess the whole way.
Oh no, no, I cannot bring her with me.
I
Maybe if I plan it some years down the line when she's old enough, strong enough to do that rigorous hiking, that would be awesome. Can do it together.
Oh my gosh. Audience members, our Fola is a girl dad and he has the most adorable daughter.
She's awesome.
And both him and his wife have been getting her into hiking and camping, and she gets the
Yes.
best seat in the house.
Yes, I
But
agree.
two more questions to wrap up. So, if
Right.
you could only listen to one of these two artists for the rest of your life, who would it be? Burna Boy or Wizkid?
Burna Boy, of course. Oh, sorry to Wizkid, but Burna Boy looks more like my kind of mature guy. Yeah,
You do love a
yeah,
good suit, don't you, Fola?
yeah. That dude is cool.
Last but not least, are you a boomer or are you a pistol Pete?
Oh, why? Don't do
You have to
that.
pick one.
Okay, I would vote for Boomer. My last school.
And with
I feel
that,
so bad. I feel so bad choosing one. I feel so bad.
oh my gosh, Polo, you you definitely made a hot potato. But no, overall, it was such a great conversation. Thank you so much for educating and sharing with us on rift linkages, early phase rifting, and some of your thoughts and some of your good advice for post graduation. And of course, for confirming to the audience that Ghana jollof is amazing. Um,
Yes. No, no, no. Nigerian jollof. Come on. Ah, I'm gonna get mad.
Thank you for being here, Bola.
Thank you for having me. This has been awesome. Thank you.